In the intricate arabesques of Middle Eastern history, few figures stand out in such an enigmatic way and shape the region's landscape like today's character, a charismatic general who knew how to enchant the world with his national pride and developmental ideas, a cold and cunning calculating diplomat, loved by the Arab world, and covered by the magic of official propaganda. Behind those well-constructed facades, he has already been a stubborn and obstinate man. With his work and career, he managed to get figures from the Arab world such as Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and the al-Assad family to court him politically, seek to emulate him, and obtain favors in his favor. He left a mark on the Egyptian world and in the non-aligned movement, remaining as an influential figure until the present times. His nationalist fervor led the Egyptians to take pride in their country and to achieve their independence after centuries of French and British occupation. This is the story of Gamal Abdel Nasser. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to like this video, leave your comments, share it with your acquaintances, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. Also support us on our Patreon, linked below. Gamal Abdel Nasser was born on January 15, 1918 in Bakos, Alexandria, a year after the tumultuous Egyptian Revolution of 1919. His father, a postal worker, and his mother, a housewife, lived in a lower-middle-class home in that city. Egypt, which once housed the longest-lasting empire in history, at that time it was militarily occupied by the British Empire since 1882. Despite the humble origins of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would become the leader of the Egyptian nation, he learned from his family and upbringing everything he needed to rise in a society where origins and castes were still important factors for social advancement and success. Nasser spent the early years of his life in a country where agitation, riots, commotion, and tumult were a daily occurrence. For decades, Egyptians demanded to be governed by their own people, until the popular and violent protests that erupted in the Egyptian Revolution of 1919 led to the end of 40 years of British occupation in 1922 with the semi-independence of Egypt after the establishment of the Kingdom of Egypt, a puppet monarchy of the British, who also refused to abandon the strategic Suez Canal that remained under their control. Interested in politics from his teenage years, Nasser would protest in the 1930s, being arrested and bailed in 1934 to later join paramilitary forces in 1935 and participate in the protests the following year. By 1937, Nasser enrolled in the military academy that had opened its doors to students from humble backgrounds like Nasser, and would begin in that house of study what would be the dawn of a long, prominent, and extended career. In the academy, his entire court shared his same ideas of Egyptian nationalist government. For the youth, these were the trendy concepts of the era. Nasser read the Quran and the biographies of Muhammad's descendants and his collaborators. He also studied world military figures like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Napoleon Bonaparte, Otto von Bismarck, Garibaldi, and Winston Churchill. He also formed friendships with those who would become his advisors in government years later, Abdel Hakim Amer and Anwar Sadat. With his charisma, intelligence, and leadership, he went through various courses and graduated well distinguished for his merits with a court of officers who admired him. After the academy, he is sent to various places on military duties, first to Mankabat, then to Khartoum, Sudan, Cairo, and then assigned as an instructor at the military academy. The nationalist vocations would become even more passionate after the incident at the Abdeen Palace in 1942, in which the British surrounded the palace of the Egyptian King Farouk to force him to demand the resignation of the Egyptian Prime Minister Hussein Siri Pasha in favor of Mustafa el-Nahas. Mustafa el-Nahas was the man the United Kingdom considered useful for their war efforts against the Axis powers during the World War. The British ambassador Miles Lamson even enters the palace armed and at gunpoint demands King Farouk to do the same, under threat of being bombed, arrested, and exiled. The threat worked because that young 22-year-old king did everything the British demanded of him. Nasser saw this as a blatant violation of Egyptian sovereignty and decided to form an organization of active nationalist officers with a view to taking control of the country. And on a personal level, Nasser had married Tahia Qasim. Following a UN declaration dividing the territories of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, thus consolidating the official recognition of the State of Israel, what would be Nasser's first formal combat experience begins, which would occur in 1948 in the context of the Israeli war in Palestine. What began as a skirmish between groups of armed Jewish fundamentalists going from village to village expelling Muslims ended in a large-scale war. And that war unified the Arab countries against the newly formed Zionist state in a war of attrition that claimed the lives of thousands of Arab soldiers, leaving wounded, mutilated, and psychologically disturbed. King Farouk was perceived as the main leader of the Arab world in a conflict that was seen by most of the region as the aggressive takeover by a hostile foreign elite of naturally Arab territories. Thus, Egypt committed itself to the war effort, but they severely underestimated the Israeli resistance, and despite Egyptian air superiority, they were quickly pushed back. Gamal Abdel Nasser served as an officer in the 6th Infantry Battalion during that war, and he was able to see firsthand the poor operational readiness of the Egyptian soldiers who suffered casualties due to the poor strategies of their superiors. Surrounded, sick, and with defective gear, Nasser and his men, about 4,000 men, fight a war of attrition in Fallujah, north of Gaza, managing to secure their position until they were surrounded by Israeli forces and forced to surrender after days of waiting for reinforcements. Nasser and his men were put in detention by the Israelis, and it was only through mediation between Cairo and Tel Aviv that he and the other prisoners were released. That war drives him to redouble his efforts in the Egyptian nationalist struggle, and after the revolution in Syria, agitating movements in the army actively begin. But these movements were detected by the defense minister and the prime minister, who arrest Gamal Abdel Nasser and interrogate him without managing to make him confess anything. Convinced of his loyalty and careful not to antagonize the army, they release him, and for 2 years Nasser continued recruiting, organizing, and conspiring. After the ratification of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty on the Suez Canal, a major navigation point in British domain that served as the gateway for trade with the Middle East and Asia, Egyptian nationalists believed that the administration of that canal should be in the hands of the citizens of their country because it was on their territory, and the canal was built with Egyptian labor. So in protest of the treaty, Nasser and his group began a campaign of political assassinations against generals and government members. But things went very wrong when Nasser and one of his collaborators, wanting to kill a general with automatic weapons, intercepting a vehicle, opened fire on the official car and failed to take down the general, but wound a few innocent bystanders and kill a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This incident deeply affected Nasser, who would avoid this type of activities for the rest of his life. What was to come would change the course of Egypt's history. July of 1952, in the context of tensions and discontent with the British, Nasser takes the opportunity to move all his followers with harangues, writings, and speeches around his ideas of national government. And at the same time, the security forces were getting closer and closer to discovering Nasser's clandestine military movement. When the authorities decided to go after Nasser and his followers, he decided to activate his plan. And the cells he had infiltrated throughout the public administration took over police stations, barracks, ministries, and other offices to prevent arrests quickly and without bloodshed. In a takeover that took just a few hours to consolidate, Nasser was astute enough to talk to Soviets and Americans about his plans so that these powers would not interfere, assuring them that the new government would not attack their commercial interests. But it was not Nasser who formally assumed power, but he had his followers put General Mohammad Naguib in charge. Naguib had greater prestige and seniority within the military and was more suitable than Nasser, who decides to stay behind the scenes. Thus, the Arab Republic of Egypt was established. As they took power, they sent King Farouk into exile, set up a council of commanders for the revolution, and delegated government actions to a civilian cabinet to present a better face to public opinion. In the face of the reforms imposed by the Council of Commanders of the Revolution, the civilian cabinet rejects them for being too radical in their application, a matter that annoys Nasser and his officers, so the following year they veto all political parties and put Nasser as the head of the only non-illegalized political party. Naguib attempts to create a rift between himself and Nasser, which would ultimately lead to his removal from office. On February 25, 1954, Naguib announces his resignation, and 2 days later, Nasser has him arrested. 3 days later, there are skirmishes in barracks between forces loyal to Naguib and Nasser's officers that quickly end after armed intervention. And then on March 5th, Nasser begins to govern by decrees, until in November of that year he formally assumes the presidency of the Revolutionary Command Council after having purged the armed opposition, executed the communists, and imprisoned much of the leadership of the Muslim Brothers, who even a month before tried to assassinate him in an attack. Gamal Abdel Nasser is the new president of Egypt. He carries out developmental reforms based on promoting the country's infrastructure, industrialization, and economic development from the state. He also assumes a Pan-Arab policy based on the union of Arab peoples, and also as a way to extend Egyptian influence beyond borders and add other countries to his cause. Nasser becomes the first major global reference for anti-colonial and anti-monarchical Arab movements that came to power in a region that after World War II was still under direct or indirect control of external powers. Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, the Syrian Revolution, and other processes that came in the following years had as a reference the revolution of Gamal Abdel Nasser. On the international aspect, Nasser made secret contacts with Israel in 1954, but came to the conclusion that peace with that country would not be possible because he saw the leadership of Tel Aviv as expansionist and disdainful for the Arabs. That same year, a conference in Indonesia, and after visits in Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, and India, Nasser and regional leaders like Joseph Broz Tito decide to create the non-aligned movement, a stance in neutrality towards the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which further stimulates his international and national prestige. Such prestige also served him to draft the following year a constitution made to his measure that submits to an approving referendum with overwhelmingly positive results for his popularity. It gives women the right to vote, prohibits discrimination based on sex, and protects women's rights in the workplace. It dissolves the Council of Commanders of the Revolution and its members separate from the military uniform to carry out the ministerial management in a civil character. But the government and politics of Birth clashed with the geopolitical purposes and commercial interests of France and the United Kingdom, who looked with disdain at the support of Birth to the revolution in Algeria, the rejection of the British-made Baghdad Pact, the recognition of Mao's China, the purchase of weapons from Czechoslovakia, his policy of neutrality that arises in the non-aligned movement, and his support for the revolutions of Arab socialism that were brewing in the Middle East and Africa. Given this, the United States and the United Kingdom decide to make the World Bank not finance the construction of a major dam in Egypt that was an integral part of the Birth project. And Nasser, in retaliation, decides to nationalize the company ruling the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956, saying that with this act the construction of the dam will be financed. He makes allegations of the unfair conditions in which the British company El Canal passed dividends to the Egyptian government and increases the salary of the Egyptians who worked in the company. With the decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, a crisis begins in which the United Kingdom and France are greatly affected. The UN Security Council passes a resolution supporting Nasser's decision as long as the passage of ships is respected. However, by October of 1956, the Egyptians find themselves invaded by the Israelis who cross the Sinai Peninsula, take over the Egyptian military bases and posts, and within a few days, British and French planes bomb the Egyptian air bases adjacent to the canal. Nasser orders his forces to withdraw from Sinai to boost the defense of the canal. and he feared that the Israeli tanks would dispatch all their artillery. The fight was tough. 2,000 Egyptian soldiers died at the hands of Israeli bullets and fires. 5,000 soldiers were taken as prisoners of war, and Nasser's advisors suggest that he surrender. But he refuses, hands out weapons to the civilian population, and organizes militias to fight. Meanwhile, the American government of Dwight Eisenhower looks with reproach at this Israeli, French, and British invasion and demands intervention by the UN. By the end of December, without achieving a result and without the support of other powers, most of the invading forces withdraw from Egyptian territory, except for the Israelis, who stayed there until March of 1957. And they release the detainees after having executed a few. Nasser responds with a reform of the civil service, restricts the civil liberties of the Jews, and several of them are made to go into exile and have their properties confiscated. In April, the Suez Canal opens its doors again, now under Egyptian control, and Nasser's position becomes stronger as the invasion looked like a failure to try to overthrow him from a propaganda standpoint. By mid-1957, Nasserist Pan-Arabism was the prevailing ideology in the Arab world, but Egypt's only concrete regional ally was Syria. In September of that year, the Turks amassed troops on the border with Syria as part of a Baghdad-Pact plot to overthrow the Syrian government, and Nasser sends military contingents to defend the Damascus government, raising his prestige in the region. As political instability grows in Syria, the idea arises that Syria and Egypt unite as a single nation-state. Nasser initially rejects the idea, citing economic disparities, lack of territorial contiguity, and Syria's past of intervening in other countries' affairs, as well as the deep social divisions among Syrians. But in 1958, the Syrians changed his mind because they expressed their fear that Syria would fall into the hands of the communists. So, in an unprecedented experience in the 20th century, by February 1st, Egypt and Syria merge into the United Arab Republic, with Nasser as its president. Nasser travels to Damascus and is greeted with large crowds, but those who believed that Nasser would use the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party in Syria, as an ally to govern the United Arab Republic were mistaken. For Nasser infiltrates his followers into the Syrian police and military intelligence agencies, disbands the political parties in Syria, including the ruling Ba'ath Party, and gives each of the provinces of Syria 2 governors. And although Nasser allows the Ba'athists to hold positions of power, they never shared these mandates on equal terms. Internationally, Jordan felt threatened by this new country, and the Syrians constantly tried to destabilize that government. Iraq joins Jordan in its resistance to Nasser's expansionism, while Syria was governed by Nasser as just another Egyptian province, which led the Syrians to orchestrate a coup in 1961 demanding reforms. And although Nasser thought about mitigating the uprising, he let the Syrians take power. And in this way, after 3 years, the experiment of the United Arab Republic dissolves. Nasser then focuses on his country. He expands his plan to modernize Egypt's technology, infrastructure, and social issues. He invests in education and health by building schools and hospitals, and constructs communication routes. By May of 1967, the Soviets give false reports to Nasser that Israel was preparing to act offensively against Syria and Egypt. In response to this, Nasser amasses forces on the Sinai borders, takes UN positions in Sharm el-Sheikh, and signs a defensive alliance with Jordan, which had allied with Iraq to deploy troops and tanks. Syria also amasses troops and tanks on its border. Israel's radio signal intelligence operators become aware of the military movements. In a joint operation, the Arab nations decide to invade Israel. But the Israeli counterattack was decisive in what was called the Six-Day War, resulting in a humiliating defeat for the Arab armies and in Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In the face of defeat, Nasser replaces the commander of the armed forces and with much remorse admits his defeat to his country and his people. In the final years of his presidency, Nasser appoints himself commander of the armed forces, president, and prime minister. He removes the military from the government and seeks to dismantle the military intelligence apparatus that had failed him in Syria and that had failed him in the Six-Day War with Israel. a thorn in his side that he would seek to remove by financing the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, Yasser Arafat's al-Fatah, with weapons and money. This movement embraces a war of attrition with thousands of different types of attacks against Israel, which the Israelis respond to with heavy artillery against these Palestinian groups, resulting in a new Arab-Palestinian refugee crisis. By 1970, at the end of an Arab League summit in September, Nasser suffers a heart attack. He is attended by doctors but dies a few hours later at the age of just 52, surrounded by his close collaborators, his wife, and his children. After his death, the Arabs went into shock and his funeral was massive, with over 5 million people in the streets, a funeral procession 10 kilometers long, accompanied by military tanks and an air parade. Nasser's legacy was Egyptian independence, British influence, and establishing a developmental dictatorship under his leadership with ideals of social justice as a prerequisite for a liberal democracy that never fully consolidated. He created infrastructure, education, a cultural boom, social welfare, and ended a feudalism that had his country in delay. And all of this came alongside the restriction of civil, political, and religious freedoms, with an extremely repressive police state and a relatively unstable economy subject to the whims of geopolitics. However, his figure as an inspiration for Arab nationalist movements remains valid to this day. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to you. I hope you enjoyed this biography. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to you. I hope you enjoyed this biography. And I ask you to leave your comments, give it a like, share the video, and in this way help us with the YouTube algorithms. I also invite you to follow us on Instagram, visit the New Encyclopedia, and support us on Patreon. See you later, and God bless.